Salma Asif had a feeling that her house in the Israeli village of Mealia was special. It stood right beside an enormous castle, so she wondered if some historic secrets were hiding just below the surface. With that in mind, Salma decided to pay for an archaeological excavation to take place underneath her abode, and they all but confirmed her suspicions. Salma's house was special, but even she couldn't have anticipated the truth. Workers digging beneath a woman's house uncovered a portal to a medieval world. Salma was spurred into action by an architectural crisis near her house. The neighboring castle was around 9 centuries old, so naturally it was beginning to fall apart. It became clear to all the residents of Mealia that something had to be done, or else someone was going to get hurt. Rabbi Kamasi, a local archaeologist, led the village's efforts in dealing with the castle. As he saw it, the residents needed to do something fast to protect the kids in the neighborhood. It wasn't as easy as just closing off the property. He explained to the Haaretz newspaper in 2019, "What child doesn't head straight for a road marked no entrance?" By the start of 2017, things were getting downright dangerous. A wall at the northern end of the castle started to collapse, which meant big segments of stone tumbled down. Rabbi recalled, "I said to my wife, if the fort falls in front of me, I have no right to live here." The archaeologist knew he needed to act before someone got really hurt. The problem, though, was that fixing up this castle wasn't going to be cheap. An estimate for the cost of the project settled at $861,000, and the government refused to help. With that, Rabbi was forced to take matters into his own hands. He painstakingly visited everyone in the village, informing them about the situation and asking for donations. The archaeologist worried all his efforts would be in vain. Luckily for Rabbi, his neighbors seemed to share his passion. He explained, "Melians love archaeology. Divided among the families, it worked out to 66 shekels per person. I asked everybody to donate the equivalent of 2 packs of cigarettes, and for that I would preserve the fort and safeguard our children and our antiquities." In the end, Rabbi managed to convince people from about 250 homes to contribute. On top of that, he wrung out a relatively small sum from the local government, plus a little extra from businesses in the area. Rabbi had pulled the community together, and the restoration project could now get underway. That larger construction project got Salma thinking. As the entire village came together to fix up the castle, she decided to finance an excavation beneath her own house. It seemed like a real shot in the dark, but Salma had a hunch that she was living on top of something huge. And it's hardly a surprise that Mealia was so full of history enthusiasts willing to dish out money for archaeological investigations. The village, after all, had a remarkably rich history that went back a long time. It's only natural, then, that Salma and her neighbors would take a passionate interest. Of course, they knew it wasn't the happiest story in the world. The history of Mealia was long and turbulent, but the Byzantine period was particularly explosive. By the year 390 AD, the land of Israel, including Mealia, was firmly under Byzantine control. As such, the inhabitants of the village had become Christians, but this wouldn't last. Within a few centuries, Islam would take over as the main religion. Even then, larger power struggles continued to upset ordinary life in the region, often through violence. So, by 1099, the land of Israel was once again under Christian control. This time, though, it was as a result of the Crusades, where invading European armies took over and established the entity known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And that turn of events forever changed Salma's hometown. This period of Christian dominance throughout Israel saw the village of Mealia thrive. It became an important center of activity, during which authorities built the castle that still stands there today. Rabbi, for his part, thinks this structure may have been the brainchild of King Baldwin III of Jerusalem in the 12th century. King Baldwin III had originally ruled over Israel alongside his mother, a woman named Queen Melisande. This arrangement broke down, however, and the two could no longer bear to work together. They split their kingdom in two, with Melisande ruling over a territory that included Jerusalem and Baldwin taking the Galilee region. Around the year 1160, Baldwin passed on control of the castle in Mealia to a knight named John of Haifa. On top of that, John was also given 9 other small communities in the surrounding area. That meant that Mealia, in practice, acted as the controlling hub of a wider fief. That made it more important than ever, but also more desired by competing powers. The tide turned once again for Mealia in 1187, when the famed Sultan Saladin took control of the region. This period of Islamic rule was fairly short-lived, though, and following the launch of the Third Crusade, the village was back under Christian control again. Those years must have been topsy-turvy for the people living there. The survivors did their best to pick up the pieces. By the year 1226 or so, the people of Galilee erected a citadel called Montfort Castle. The construction of this newer castle seems to have undermined the status of Mealia, which started to falter around the same time. The village's glory days were firmly coming to an end. The Islamic Mamluks then reigned over Mealia for a spell, but the region soon fell under the control of the Ottomans. At this point around the 15th century, though, something dramatic happened in the area. It appears that Mealia collapsed, and nobody fully understands exactly why. Speaking to Haaretz, Rebbe said, "We find no mention from that time, nor has any pottery from that period been discovered so far." By the following century, though, the historical record tells us that Mealia was no longer the important spot it once was. Only a small number of people continued to inhabit it. While historians aren't sure of exactly what happened to Mealia, Rebbe does have a couple of his own ideas. He suggested that some catastrophe afflicted the city, be that a big earthquake or a pandemic. The Black Death, after all, wasn't just confined to Europe around the medieval era. The phase of Mealia's history that takes us to the present began around the 1740s when Greek Catholics moved into the village where they constructed homes and had families. The modern residents of Mealia, including Rebbe, can largely trace their lineages back to these people. As we've seen, Mealia experienced plenty of dramatic changes throughout its long unstable history. It should be no surprise, then, that the people who live in the area today are so interested in preserving and learning about its past. That's ultimately what drove Rebbe to undertake excavations there, though he uncovered more surprises than he bargained for. The castle at Mealia was obviously a pressing concern for Rebbe. Its deteriorating state meant it needed to be shored up to keep locals safe, not to mention to preserve a key piece of history. But he soon turned his attention to a much smaller and less notable site in the village. It was Salma Asaf's house. Salma's ancestors had first arrived in Mealia up to 250 years ago, meaning she has a deep connection to the place. She was even willing to throw her home into disarray in order to get some answers about the past. She spoke about this in very plain terms, remarking to Haaretz, "I wanted to know what was underneath my home." Using their own money, Salma and her family paid for Rebbe to conduct some excavations beneath their home. This quickly led to amazing results, with the archaeologist finding a wall dating back to the time of the Crusades. This was encouraging, but more works would be necessary, and they wouldn't come cheap. Salma had to drum up the money for further excavations herself, but enough cash was eventually raised to carry on. The archaeologists could keep digging, which meant peeling through the layers of the village's varied history. And thankfully, all the work and money proved to be worth it when they found something spectacular. Beneath Salma's house, the archaeologists found some sort of facility that dated back to the Crusades. It was split into two rooms, which were situated over a large stone pit. The space was pretty large, and experts were quickly able to deduce what it had been used for. It was a winery. You might be wondering why that's supposedly such a big deal, right? Well, Rebbe spoke about that in an article for the magazine Wine Spectator. He explained, "Before this discovery, we didn't know almost anything about this kind of industrial agriculture. And now we just know more and more." This Crusader winemaking facility was something like 3 times as big as the largest one ever discovered in the past. It's thought there was even a second floor at one point in time, which would have been quite impressive for the era. Evidence for this additional level, though, isn't entirely clear. Rebbe shared some thoughts about how this site actually operated. Having studied medieval documents, he knew that many people in the region had their own vineyards. What they lacked, however, were the necessary facilities to press their grapes into wine. So, what did these thirsty people do? Well, as Rebbe sees it, it's possible they brought the grapes from their own vineyards over to this facility in Mealia. Then, in order to use the equipment set up there, they agreed to give the winery's owner a share of the resulting wine. The owner could store his grape juice in some sort of vat on the site, where it would ferment and become wine. The client, meanwhile, would take the pressed grape juice back home to ferment it. This theory definitely stands up, as evidence for winemaking in homes around the region has been discovered in the past. The discovery of this winery is really important, as it sheds light on how medieval Israel's society actually functioned. It tells us something about the economic realities, for one thing, but also the lived experience of normal people. It should go without saying that Rebbe was absolutely delighted by his discovery. In the Wine Spectator piece, Rebbe said, "The wine presses that I found were built in a very high quality, and their style is exceptional." So we know, not only do we have a Frankish village, but that it was a very important Frankish village. Mealia was probably the main wine producer in all the northern part of the kingdom. It seems the winery met its end when the Mamluks took over Mealia around the middle of the 13th century. They had no need for the facility, so they simply built something else on top of it. The once thriving site remained hidden away for centuries, and maybe it would have been lost forever were it not for Salma's enthusiasm and Rabay's expertise. As part of a new business venture from Salma and her family, the site reopened, now with a full restaurant attached. Appropriately, the menu puts a great emphasis on wine. And best of all, visitors get to look down into the old facility. Maybe all the money the Asaf family invested into the excavations was worth it then. After all, their new restaurant has a truly unique appeal. How many places can say they're built on top of an old winery from Crusader times? That's sure to convince both foodies and history buffs alike to come visit. And that's not the end of their vision either. As Haaretz reported in August 2019, the Asafs laid out plans to open up a museum on the site as well. It looked like the winery would finally return to its former glory and more. But as for Rabay, he just wanted to keep on excavating to learn as much about his village as possible. It's safe to say that Rabay has his work cut out for him. Mealia, after all, is sitting on centuries, millennia, even, of history. Who knows what else he might find hidden away in his village? Given what he's found so far, you'd have to think there are plenty more interesting artifacts to stumble across. Mealia residents have uncovered relics from the Crusades and the Byzantine era, but some of the other discoveries found in this area have been found to be far older than even that. The oldest discovery actually takes us back 10,000 years, but there's every reason to believe the area was inhabited before that. Anyone with an interest in human history should be grateful that Rabay took the initiative to begin investigating his village. Getting the money together to excavate at Mealia wasn't necessarily easy, but he nonetheless persevered. There's no doubt that other discoveries in the region inspired him, especially since experts in his field found some much older treasures, some of which dated back to biblical times. In 2019, a team of scholars were working in the Shahria Forest, which sits in the Judean foothills. This whole region is of central historic and religious importance, as it's mentioned multiple times in the Old Testament. You can imagine, then, how exciting any new archaeological discovery from around there truly is. On this occasion, the researchers had found an old, fragmented jug lying beneath the surface. To the untrained eye, perhaps, this discovery wouldn't seem so earth-shattering, but the experts knew different. So, they analyzed it in greater detail and soon reached a wild conclusion. This thing was definitely worth paying attention to. When they attempted to date the pot, the researchers discovered that it was phenomenally old. According to Smithsonianmag.com, it came from around the year 1100 BC, which had an interesting implication. This meant it traced back to the same period when a particular book of the Bible was written. The biblical text in question is the Book of Judges, which historians claim depicts events from around 1200 to 1050 BC. Given the timescales involved here, learning about such a period is really quite difficult. So, if this jug in the ground can help to shed light on that time, then it really is something special. The site where the archaeologists had been working is called Khirbet al-Ray, and it reportedly stretches out across roughly 4 acres. This is by no means the biggest site around, but it's nonetheless proving to be extremely important. Given the wider region where it sits, though, that maybe isn't too surprising. The area has a mind-bogglingly rich and fascinating history, after all. The jug found at the site appears to link the region with the Book of Judges. This is an important collection of writings from the Old Testament, which is thought to have been compiled sometime around 550 BC. This was during the period of the Babylonian exile, when many Jews were forced to leave Israel by the Babylonians. Given this context, then, the Book of Judges is largely focused on how foreign powers were influencing Israel. The text posits that this situation was occurring because inhabitants of the land were worshipping deities of a people known as the Canaanites. In response, the Hebrew God punished them by allowing their land to fall to foreign invaders. The Book of Judges is defined by a repeated rise and fall in the fortunes of Israel's people. The citizens will experience a time of hardship under foreign occupation, but they will then ask for God's aid. The Lord responds and helps them, and the cycle resets and continues. Contrary to the title of the biblical text's title, the story's focus wasn't on judges as we might think of them. Instead, they were actually sort of military leaders. This is reflected in the Hebrew term used to describe them, which is shafat. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, This more accurately translates to ruler rather than judge. The Book of Judges, then, tells the story of these leaders, who were known to be charismatic figures. The individuals apparently aimed to free Israel from its foreigner occupiers, so they were obviously considered to be pivotal figures of the society. And that's reflected in the central role played by them in the text. The judges were revered as the figureheads of the land of Israel. We can see this attitude expressed in a quote inscribed on an ancient tablet, which was uncovered back in 1929. The scribe in this case proclaims the importance of them, writing, "Our judge, above whom there is no one." Judges weren't elected to power, nor were they selected on the basis of familial bonds. These individuals were instead said to be chosen by God himself, who'd select them on the basis of their leadership skills. Apparently, it was a judge's job to mend the people of Israel's relationship with the Lord. The thing that most characterized the judges was their personal charm, which they would utilize in order to hold sway over people. In this way, charisma could be viewed as a sort of spiritual power to be wielded by the judges. It also ensured that they were able to keep people in line. Many people held the role of a judge at different points in time, though the Book of Judges itself is only concerned with a select few. These include figures like Deborah, Barak, Samson, and Gideon. And it was thanks to them that the citizens of Israel were able to overcome their foreign oppressors. Deborah is one of the more notable judges who is mentioned in the biblical text. She was a seer, someone with an ability to see the future. Deborah also engaged in poetry, could interpret dreams, and apparently possessed a charm that seemed to have been gifted to her from God. Aside from Deborah, Gideon is a leader who features prominently in the Book of Judges. He is said to have become a judge following a visit from an angel who'd been sent by God. Apparently, it was the Lord's wish that Gideon rule over the people of Israel and help them drive away their foes. If his name is anything to go by, Gideon may have been a formidable judge. Translated from Hebrew, the name means something like destroyer or mighty warrior, though another translation is feller of trees. Aside from that, though, Gideon has also been mentioned in the Bible as a prime example of a faithful individual. Gideon occupies a prominent role in the Book of Judges, but we can't exactly say how accurate the text's description of him is. The same goes for the wider details contained in the text, as genuine archaeological evidence from the period when it was written is lacking. Things may now have changed, though. The jug that experts uncovered in southern Israel in 2019 may represent genuine evidence of Gideon's existence. If that's the case, then it would be the first discovery of its kind. Basically, the artifact dates back to the time when he was active, and it bears some script on its surface. Experts think this says Jerubbaal, which was a nickname for Gideon. Speaking to the Times of Israel, an expert from George Washington University explained that this translation of the text on the jug is probably accurate. Christopher Ralston told the newspaper in July 2021, "The reading Jerubbaal is the most logical and reasonable reading, and I consider it quite definitive. I would hasten to add that this script is well known and nicely attested, so we can read it with precision." On the other hand, historian Michael Langlois was more reluctant to jump to conclusions. From his point of view, the writing on the jug isn't entirely clear to read, so it should be treated with skepticism. He said, "The inscription is fragmentary, which calls for caution." In any case, the discovery of the jug represents progress in an archaeological project that has been taking place since 2015. It is being led by people from the Israel Antiquities Authority, the Institute of Archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Though this particular item may be up there with the best finds in all that time. The Kerbet Rai site has actually been subject to archaeological probes since the 19th century. Back then, experts from Britain were behind the work. But in 2015 it was decided by an entirely different team to go there and start working again. They clearly understood how important the area was. The jug pretty much justifies this decision, as it could be a really important discovery. It has a roughly 1 liter capacity, and the item looks like it may once have been used to hold special liquids. According to the experts, it could have stored oil, medicine, or maybe even perfume back in its day. Thanks to modern testing techniques such as radiocarbon-14 dating, the archaeologists reportedly managed to trace the jug back to the year 1050 BC. Moreover, analysis of its makeup led to the conclusion that it had been created in the same region where it was found. It's clear, then, that a lot of information can be figured out with these sophisticated analytical methods. The researchers don't have the ability to figure absolutely everything out, though. There are still things left open to interpretation, like the ink used on the jug. It's been suggested that this substance was made from iron oxide and black ash, which would align with other discovered artifacts from the same era. Having said that, such a theory hasn't been confirmed, according to the Times of Israel. The limited information researchers have to work with means that it's quite challenging to create a rounded story of the jug. One idea about the item, though, is that it was broken before being discarded. The container was found in several pieces inside some sort of storage unit, so it seems to have been swept up after being fragmented. Despite the more ambiguous aspects of the jug and its history, research has told us some things. When George Washington University's Christopher Rolstow examined it, he could draw on his expertise as a language and inscription expert to formulate his own thoughts about the object's history. Specifically, these related to the letters on its surface. The letters on the jug look and sound quite like Hebrew. But in actual fact, the alphabet isn't from that language. It's actually an alphabet from which Hebrew would evolve in the preceding centuries. Hebrew can trace its evolution back to this other text, so we can say that they're similar, but not the same. Hebrew University of Jerusalem professor Yosef Garfinkel elaborated on the language seen on the jug in an interview with the Jerusalem Post. He told the newspaper in July 2021, the alphabetic script was invented by the Canaanites and the Egyptian influence right about 1800 BC. They continued to use this script, which evolved from Egyptian hieroglyphs in the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age. The Hebrew and Phoenician scripts were developed only in the middle of the 10th century BC. What about the inscription itself, though? Why is it important that it says Jerubbaal? Well, experts Garfinkel and Saar Gaynor explained, the name is familiar from biblical tradition in the Book of Judges as an alternative name for the judge Gideon ben Yosh. Gideon is first mentioned as combating idolatry by breaking the altar to Baal and cutting down the Asherah pole. In biblical tradition, he is then remembered as triumphing over the Midianites, who used to cross over the Jordan to plunder agricultural crops. The archaeologists went on, according to the Bible, Gideon organized a small army of 300 soldiers and attacked the Midianites by night near Mai and Herat. In view of the geographical distance between the Shephelah and the Jezreel Valley, this inscription may refer to another Jerubbaal and not the Gideon of biblical tradition. Although the possibility cannot be ruled out that the jug belonged to the judge Gideon. In any event, the name Jerubbaal was evidently in common usage at the time of the biblical judges. If this jug really is linked to Gideon, then it would be an unprecedented development. Hard evidence from the biblical judges era is almost unheard of, so that's why the inscription on the jug has caused such a stir. It's a discovery that might finally shed light on an otherwise murky history. How historically accurate the Bible is has been subject to scholarly debate for a long time. But this jug might just confirm the existence of Gideon, which would imply the Book of Judges is in some way truthful to reality. That's an important discovery, in that it backs up the Bible as being a somewhat trustworthy source. Even if the jug didn't belong to the judge Gideon himself, the item is still important. It might simply be evidence of people from that time passing on stories with the help of objects. Maybe the inscription on the cup was a way of protecting the memory of Gideon and passing it on to future generations. Aside from everything else, the jug and its inscription have helped experts gain an insight into how language spread around the region all those thousands of years ago. In an article in the Times of Israel, the inscription is described as a textual bridge for the transition from the Canaanite to the Israelite and Judahite cultures. Michael Langlois told the newspaper, for decades, there were practically no inscriptions of this era and region. To the point that we were not even sure what the alphabet looked like at that time. There was a gap. Some even argued that the alphabet was unknown in the region, that there were no scribes, and that the Bible must therefore have been written much later. Discoveries such as this jug are so valuable in helping historians to figure out what was going on in Israel at the time when the Old Testament was being put together. In this specific case, we can catch a glimpse of how language was preserved as eras and civilizations evolved and changed. Yep, it's a telling discovery. Reflecting on the jug and its implications, Langlois concluded, these inscriptions are still rare, but they are slowly filling the gap. They not only document the evolution of the alphabet, they show that there was in fact continuity in culture, language and traditions. The implications for our understanding of biblical history are vast and exciting. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.